of you, all of you.
So
most of you are probably familiar with what happened last month. Anybody listen to that? Frank Stacio's State of Things last month, where this talk was being heavily promoted and hugely promoted, where they were talking about what just talk to the rock star of the digital era and the digital age. So they were pretty much talking about Paul, and it was really being marketed as exactly what I said now. It was being marketed as the rock star of the digital era. So it's our pleasure to have Paul come and talk to us, and we've been trying to schedule Paul for the last couple of years, and we finally made that happen today. Most of you here, in fact all of you know Paul personally and know of Paul certainly, and he truly is a rock star in the digital era. He's really been at the forefront of just about every technological innovation in society for the last 15-20 years, at least to my knowledge, probably even before that too. So Paul has a lot of diverse interests to his credit, and is very, very accomplished in a lot of different areas too. So he serves on several boards related to technology, and in many ways in this technology could just be a peripheral part. Probably his biggest accomplishment to date has really been his pioneering work in being founder director of iBiblio, and I think the world over really owes a huge tribute to him for that. As a result, he's also been recognized in so many circles for his work in pioneering open source communications and really making information free and available to so many different folks. So he's won many awards. He's been recognized as one of the heroes of computer world. He's pretty much flies all over the world for different conferences and doing talks and whatnot. Serves on several boards: the Intra-Health Open Project, the UNC-Renzi Launchpad, the Gillings Acceleration Centers, the UNC Gillings Global School of Public Health. Also serves on board of UNC Public Libraries, Chapel Hill Public Libraries Trustees, the North Carolina Writers Network. We've got all these various wide interests, also published extensively, not just in terms of the popular press, not just being quoted there, but also in terms of proceedings of the ACM, as well as some books which he's written and edited too. With all this, he also has a pretty filthy mind, as he says. So he's also an accomplished poet, and he's done a lot of very interesting poetry, where he has published in some of the top journals, as well as wide circulation newspapers as well. So some of Paul's poetry has actually been featured in the best of American erotic poetry too, which I strongly recommend that you take a look at sometime to get into the depth of his filthy mind too. But he says with all these numerous accomplishments, what he's proudest of is the fact that he was named Geek of the Year in the Triangle 5 years ago. And he's also been inducted into the luxurious flowing hair for scientists. And like I said, some of Paul's recent interests have really looked at the whole notion of online communities, and especially how the notion of community itself is changing so much with the rapidly changing media environment, and that's what he's going to be talking to us today. So, Paul.
Thanks. So you could have seen the slides ahead of time, but I always shuffle them and they always change. And you may have, nobody was at Cyber Speech Day at the law school, right? Okay, well, I'm not going to give that talk, but I'm going to use the same slides. And how many people are in Kathy Packer's media law class? Excellent. I gave the class yesterday, or Tuesday too, but I'm not going to give that same talk, but I'm going to use the same slides. About my filthy mind, I borrowed it. It's actually, even though this particular poem is in Best American Erotic Poems, 1800 present, because apparently before 1800 there wasn't any American erotic poetry. Poem is not American, and it's not from the period 1800 to present, and it's not very erotic, it's just filthy. So it's a version of a 14th century Welsh poem. If you think of what was happening in English in the 14th century, that's Chaucer. So you get kind of an idea. Welsh people are much more creative. But somehow I ended up, and by accident of birth, a poet named Dana Gioia is on the facing page, who was George Bush, the head of the National Endowment for the Arts under George Bush. His poem involves cats, and it's not as good as you're probably imagining. Okay, so I can't say what mine was. It's too filthy. So this is about a media gap, how it's being filled, and what it means to communities. And there is, by the way, an extensive reading list and footnotes at the end. So my challenge will be to try to talk about all that. This is a great chart that came from originally, I saw it first in Russell Newman's Future of the Mass Audience, which came out in 1990. It's the 1980s chart, and I hope you'll appreciate I've used 1980s graphics to make this. And it's a paper that's only been cited like about 3 times. Tomita is a Japanese scholar who gave a presentation at a conference on newspapers and democracy in 1980. And he did something that was really smart, I think. And I'll tell you why, and why this matters about how we conceptualize the various spaces that are out there, where the legal regimes are, and where our sort of moral and other expectations happen. Okay, audience size goes this way on this little chart, and time delay goes this way, and what? Oh yeah, I'm going to make it harder for you. I'm sorry. You can see down here is speech. It's where it all started. And you can see that telephone, because it's to small audience, and because it's light conversation, it's immediate, these things get conceptualized together. And not only are they conceptualized together, that's where, and this is going to be an American point of view, but it also goes kind of worldwide, but it's specifically American. This is what's protected or impinged or controlled by speech laws. Okay, so when the telephone came along, we immediately saw it as speech. We put it right here, and we gave it pretty much the same rules that we give speech. So here's the First Amendment free speech, or speech zone. Whatever speech you have, it also has the same regulations. And then we had a disruptive technology show up. It took about 500 years for it actually to kind of settle how it was disrupting. But that's print. We had writing, and you might argue that that started earlier. But letters, newsletters, books, movies are sort of their own separate world slightly. Newspapers and magazines and print culture, and those all fall under press in our experience. But we all saw what happened when this stuff started happening, came into the fore. We saw a change in religion. We saw 400 years of war in Europe. We saw fracturing of religion. We saw more people having more access to learning. We saw something really happen different in which books were themselves imbibed as some special power, something different than speech, something that was transformative, to the point that the 3 major religions that came out of the Middle East, Muhammad calls them the people of the book. All of these people have things that are set down. Press also has its own laws, and it also has a different responsibility. The people who speak something have responsibility. The people who hear it, not so much. In the press, or in the time of the press, the people who set the ink down have responsibility too. So if you're the publisher, if you're paying to have the print, you get responsibility. And it gets a whole different section, of course, in the way that we look at how rights are worked out, how we have rights and restrictions and licensing and freedom. And different countries negotiate this in different ways, but that power is seen its own way. Then, in the 20th century, we had these guys show up. Oddly enough, telephone could have been here. The first, as you probably know, telephone was originally seen as an information distribution device, not a point-to-point device in America. So some of the early cartoons are of one guy standing in front of a microphone talking into the wires, and the wires are going out to different places in which rooms like this are hearing the speech of a demagogue or a politician or a religious leader, in which symphonies are being delivered to your home over the wire, sort of like cable. Due to a patent deadlock, radio, which was originally conceptualized as point-to-point, became mass communication. and telephone until we got cable, seen the speech. These guys are out there in part because, to me, this is a case where policy created, froze, almost literally, innovation. Everybody, there was a moral panic, of course, when these things came. People don't know how to deal with them. Everybody, the governments immediately saw that they could be disruptive to government or other things. Governments immediately looked for ways to control them, and they had a great argument to use. You know, radio and television aren't very good. They require a lot of bandwidth. That bandwidth is scarce. Somebody has to be the referee about who gets that bandwidth. I think it should be us. The effect of that policy is not much innovation of using bandwidth better. Until, actually fairly recently, last 25 years. So you have this whole period in which FM radio gets frozen because they decide they don't want to disrupt their own market, RCA. In fact, the guy who invented it walks out the window, he's so depressed. But this stuff gets its own separate laws and its own separate legal model and its own conceptualization about how it relates to society. Now, what Tomoda said is, and this is in 1980, he just says, you know, there's something that will be an intermediate time delay and deal with a different kind of audience size. And whatever happens, I don't know what that is, but I see all these different devices coming. I see like satellite television, I see cable, I see more spectrum open because of FM and AM. You didn't really know what was going on, but he said something here is going to change. And the interesting idea to me is we know what's in that gap, right? Pretty much. Yeah, we do. Because we have these, or you have those. And we know there are lots of ways to fill that gap with all kinds of different intermediate audience size, some sort of different time delay. And we also know, and we particularly saw this at Cyber Speech Conference and at a conference at Duke last weekend or weekend before called No Law, First Amendment and Meets Copyright Law by David Lang. Lawyers are trying to conceptualize, like, what is this stuff? Well, is it like telephone, is it conversation like telephone? Does it have speech protection? And the answer they'll say is, well, probably not, because it's fixed and you can find it later. It's not that fixed, it can go away. So press is one of the models that they had. So at Cyber Speech Day, one of the things that was proposed is any posting on an internet bulletin board, it should be held to the same standards as a letter to editor in a newspaper. And whoever ran that bulletin board should have the same responsibility as a letter of an editor of a newspaper. I couldn't believe it. Does anybody think that's a really good idea? But all the lawyers were about, oh yeah, that's great. And I talked to Bill Marshall, who's a wonderful First Amendment law expert, and he said, I don't know why you're complaining. The internet got the freest pass out there. And I went, what freest pass do you mean? He said, you got the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and that's a great freedom. How many people think Digital Millennium Copyright Act is a great freedom generator? Why would he think that? Because coming from a press viewpoint, he constructed that this guy is press, and he said, you know, ISPs get a shelter. They're not responsible for the content that they carry. If you conceptualize this space as looking like that, that's not completely stupid. If you're me and you saw it as speech and ephemeral and said, you know, it's just speech, it's just out there, it's just people being casual, it doesn't have any of this formality, then it makes no sense at all. If you're somebody, a country that's used to controlling the media more strongly, this model is more closer to what you want. But we know something else is happening in here. So in 1990, Newman actually did a really smart reformalization. And he said, let's look at those things. And this is where he and I have a slight argument. But he said, all the stuff in this space, we just know that is conversation. And that has its own, it doesn't matter what the technology is. It just, if it's fairly small audience size and it's fairly immediate, then it's probably like conversation, so it's probably like speech, so it's probably there. And out here, and we know how that civil law works there, there's your First Amendment stuff, First Amendment speech. And then we have mass communication out here, and it's mostly one way. You know, it's like broadcast. When you talk about mass communication, it's broadcast, right? Of some sort. And that, you know, everybody doesn't get a book, and everybody doesn't get a newspaper. But I mean, you know, you're an individual, me, you don't get to write it. Yeah.
The axes supposed to be the same?
Yeah, pardon me, they are the same. The axes are the same. This is time delay and audience size. Did I mess that up?
No.
Because I'm dyslexic and I will split on one second. Okay, so what the smart thing that Newman did is say in this middle space is group participation. This is where people are doing remixes, this is where people are sharing, this is where people are doing all this other work, this is your bulletin boards, this is all this other stuff. And this space, which is a very strong democratic space, is quite different here. So now I want to go back and look at the last time communities changed and how we talked about the changing idea about what community is, and then we're going to try to get some ideas about what happens in this space. So, so I'll give you an unscholarly description of Ferdinand Tönnies. How many people have read Tönnies? Excellent. How many people can pronounce the two words that are on top?
Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft.
Okay, very good. So I don't have to say it again. I was going to say it just like that. And but Tönnies is a German guy who grew up in a small village, came to the city, and was shocked. This is the period of urbanization. Everybody came and they were shocked because suddenly there was privacy, there was anonymity, there was a change of roles, and that's still happening. By the way, urbanization is not a project that's ended. But Tönnies said, well, even in the way cities used to be, because communications were so close together, depended on face-to-face, that cities were in quarters or literally little villages stuck together. But now in this new period, they weren't little villages stuck together anymore so much. There was something bigger happening and something that needed to change. Tönnies is also the formation of the modern German state. So he's noticing some other stuff that's going on. And he says this one, which is often called community, and this one, Gesellschaft, which is often called society. And the nice thing about community is everybody knows everybody. You don't really have privacy because there's depth of knowledge of each other. You're usually slightly isolated, either by being in your own neighborhood or being wherever. And everybody is mutual. You know that this person is like me and we're going to help each other out. Mutuality is really highly defined. And a lot of the codes of behavior are understood. They're your mores. You know, your mama tells you, our family doesn't do that kind of thing, as we say in the South. And that kind of thing might be walking down the street with your cigarette lit. We always sit down to smoke because it's not genuinely or ladylike to walk with a cigarette. So, but I mean, it can be that granular, but it can also be, you know, tougher things that are accepted, who you marry, who you talk to, when you eat, how you behave at the table, all these kind of things that are passed within a small community. And then in Gesellschaft, he said there's something emerging, a concept of a broader society. And in that society, which often becomes a nation, and is expressed largely in cities or states in that period, you actually have individuality. And that he's non-unique in thinking this. It's a period in which people really are figuring out that they are who they are. The period in which people who are like your age are a little younger, have more autonomy than ever before. You're not living, you know, you're not going home to sleep with your in the same house with your grandparents. You're not having to work the fields together as a family unit, not having to do any of that. But when you get this kind of thing, you need laws that are there that are really well understood, that have a uniform enforcement system. So Tönnies, it says there's this balance going on there as urbanization creates nationalism. Did I just do this right? Yeah, okay. In America, there is, people are also noticing things change. How many people read Lippmann? How many people also read Dewey? Okay, good, because Dewey's the good guy that was the jerk. We don't have any debate, right? Don't have to say that. Okay. Dewey was really interested in what a public is, what a democratic republic is, and stuff like that. And he started out thinking that you can only have community where people are face to face. The only way you can really know each other is face to face. The only way you can really have a group cohere. It's sort of the New England town meeting. It's like about as complex a government you can have. But he said, yes, there is an idea of a great community, bar in which is full intercommunication is conceivable in 1927, even anything has happened yet. But it'll never be the same way as a local community. I say this because we're going to rehear this later, right? How many people have heard that? You can be online, but it's not the same. Doesn't matter how good that free and full intercommunication is happening. Even if you saw them on Skype, it doesn't really count. So, but by 1940, oh, I left his name off. Who knows who said this? Martin Buber said this in Paths to Utopia in 1949. He, being a Zionist and recreating Israel, but was also worried about some other stuff, said a real community is not necessarily people that have to be face-to-face all the time or perpetually together. That it consists somewhere else in which this idea of mutuality is bigger than face-to-face. Already, he's saying, you know, these divisions that Tony set up, they're not quite divisions. That there's some sort of bleed in which mutuality, we know now and measure as social capital, is really what keeps things going together. Those are the ties that hold us all there. And we have mutual access, we're comrades, we're ready to help each other out, we're ready to make all this happen. And probably the best definition for me, and this is when I use on virtual communities class because it carries around a bit, is Thomas Bender, writing the 80s. Community is best defined as a network of social relationship marked, again, by mutuality, and he adds emotional bonds. And when we talk about social capital, that's where these exchanges happen a lot in there. But now let's talk about how to operationalize this in a really different way. So for a long time, people thinking like Tony's and stuff started looking at family groups, and they said, you know, we can understand social networks by understanding how these tight groups of people with tight bonds work with each other, and then how the information goes through them, from a communication standpoint, how they help each other out. We can measure friendship strengths by saying things like, if you had 2 children and one of them is sick and you have to take one to the doctor, you have to leave one with somebody else, who would that somebody else be? Because that's pretty strong, right? You're not going to like leave your child with like some loser you don't know. And it really sees how these communities work. How tight are those bonds? Those tight bonds were seen by Tony's and others as ways that made community happen. But Mark Granabetter looked at it and said, you know, the tight bond stuff is all really good, but there's something else. There's something in which somebody who is kind of a member of this group and kind of a member of this group can bring in new ideas and new communications and new changes that will rush through that other group. But you need this, and in social capital we call this bridging capital. That these, and this is very popular with internet people because we all talk about Granabetter's strength of weak ties, in which he says weak ties are so strong that that's actually how you get everything done. You know, you don't actually get that, you know, your work group or your family or your clan might really be tight, but they're not going to get anything done unless they have a lot of bridging stuff going on, a lot of communication outside of themselves. So the real problem about how to do bridging capital is how to make it not cost a lot to do, make it transaction rate lower, and seamless and effective and trusted. Because you have to figure out like how to trust this kind of outsider who's bringing this message in there. So the issues that we see on virtual communities are tied to all three of those: trust, identity and authority, and the value of that information, past and present, how that comes in. And also how the maintenance of those things. Because we all know, you go to a party and you meet somebody, you have some great ideas, and then you walk out and you don't ever see them again, and it's gone. So, strong tie network with bridging capital. This is a really important one, and what's really kind of wild to me is nobody actually paid attention to this till 1970s. And this paper still gets lots of play. Now, there's some other people that say things are a little bit different. How many people know what Dunbar's number is? Raise hands high so I can see. Because you guys don't get to answer the next one. Okay, so Robin Dunbar is an evolutionary psychologist. That means he cracks open monkey skulls and measures them. And humans too. He could have been probably a heavy metal musician, all the skull cracking that was going on. But Dunbar says there is a theoretical cognitive limit. I mean, your brain can only deal with so much. Your brain, and it's based on the size of your neocortex. He got to that by cracking open. First he looked at monkeys, simians mainly, and he said, there seems to be a standard size that different species of apes, how big their troops get to be. There's some external controls, like how much money and whether the leopard's handy, or whether the environment is okay. But the environment's okay, they only get so big. And even though there's plenty of food and there's no danger, it doesn't get any bigger. Instead, they fracture. And they always come back to the same number. And then he started measuring. He said, your neocortex, there's a ratio. Yeah?
Dunbar's number, is this the perception that the individual has, or is this
all you can deal with? It just can't function.
Everywhere?
Just can't function. Yeah, everywhere. It cannot be big.
That every person has, or the same
every
number?
Every species, yeah.
Okay.
And except Bill Clinton, but we'll get to that in a minute. Bill Clinton is a mutant and does not exist in this world. But what he says in a book called, and this will give you a hint, Grooming Gossip and the Evolution of Language, he says that what really holds that troop together is understanding who can groom whom. And if you can't keep all that in your head, you get a smackdown because you groom the wrong person in the wrong order or the wrong chump. They don't like that very much, and it eventually ends up with your exile from chumpdom. You have to go make your own shampoo. You become a chump. And so, pardon me? Did I say something? Just check. Okay, you can type it up there. So these are relationships in which an individual knows who that person is and how that person relates to every other person in their network. And he says, that one doesn't count that there's a fixed number for humans, and he looked around, and he enumerates several cases of this in Grooming Gossip and the Evolution of Language. Certain groups of humans only, when they're left alone, that's all they do. Hunter-gatherers, this number, then they split. We know this from watching Native Americans. Hutterite villages, that way. Certain Anglican churches, like in certain groups, they just decided, this is how big a congregation should be. After that, they split it. So, because and he says, if you get a bigger number than this, your brain explodes, unless you're both on. So, yeah.
How many people does it take in a Facebook group for your brain to explode?
Well, that's a good question. We're going to get to this.
Okay.
So I'm leading you there. So, how many people know the Dunbar number? Okay, so you guys don't get to vote. Don't tell, and try to keep your poker face. How big do you think this number is for human beings. We'll worry about chimpanzees later. How many people can you have in your tribe, in your village, before your head explodes?
150.
Did you cheat? That's the number. It's actually 148.7, right? So, plus or minus. Well, you can only know somebody far away. I mean, you wonder why there's a fraction? So, around 150, unless you're Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton apparently has everybody at excess capacity. He's famous for not needing a prompter when he goes to a town. He just like remembers everybody. Nobody else does that. I mean, you know, every other politician has somebody standing on their shoulder or with your plug or something, somebody's prompting him. But Clinton doesn't use any of that. He's the uber ape. So, so now to get to your question, one of the questions, and I have some questions down here that I'm actually asking myself through these readings and through observation, is does the internet, there's two questions to this, I guess. The first one does social networking software act as a mental prosthesis to allow you to know and maintain more relationships than 150? What do you guys think? Okay, stay with me because there is some research on that. Yeah?
I have a question. So this number 150 is not only people you know, but also you know how all of them relate.
Right.
Definition.
Yeah.
So you can know more people, but you don't necessarily know how they relate to those 150.
Exactly.
So that's why it has constant floating, right?
That's right. Yeah. Otherwise, you don't know whether you can groom with them or not. You know what to talk to them from a gossip and language standpoint. You know what you can talk to them about.
I'll stick to the weather.
Huh?
I'll stick to the weather sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know this person well enough or where they fit to really tell them my secret. You know, maybe. So, other people say you could get larger if you, the stronger your norms and laws are, that it could be bigger. And you could still have a cohesive group. Part of that Dunbar gets at later in a number of books on evolutionary biology, psychology, pardon me. And if you're interested in that, he actually did a beginner's book called Evolutionary Psychology for Beginners. That's extremely useful because, I mean, you might not want to read all his research, you just want the gist, right? So, but then when you cite it, because we're good scholars, you do it. So keep that in mind. Here, just for fun, just in case you didn't get it, here's how monkeys work, and here's how the great apes work. Their little group, and you can see there's a nice little line you can lay, and they're on it, and that's all really nice. But Dunbar actually is a little more granular than this. His big book is that 150 number, which is known on the internet as your monkey sphere, because you cannot get beyond your innate monkeyness to be any bigger. But this is your family, generally. These are the people you really trust with your deepest, darkest secrets. These are the people who are your sort of closer, these are your really trusted friends. These are the people who you have more intimate relationships with on a daily basis, and this is your 150. And after that, he says, we haven't found anybody who can actually manage over 1,500, because apparently it has not been Bill Clinton. But that is out there. But he postulates that there are further spheres there, and that some of these are conceptualized relationships that could be carried on by communications technology. So, in print, how many people have read Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities? Yeah, so this is you. What is it? What makes nations? What's the major technology?
Well, it's Imagine Communities.
Yeah, but what helps you imagine it? What's the communications technology that helps you do it? He claims newspapers. Newspapers help standardize language. And once language is standardized, it's one of the strongest cohesive forces for imagining community and imagining nation. You can see this in Europe where the countries break up based on language. Multi-language countries are late 20th century. They started emerging post-World War II from things that were submerged, but you don't get. And some of those languages were illegal. So, for example, Welsh, which I happen to know a little bit about, it accidentally was illegal up until the 1950s because the British forgot it was illegal. But they made it illegal because they didn't want, they wanted all the Welshmen to learn English, and we're kind of okay. Or in Turkey, Kurdish and some other particular languages are subservient. You can't use them. You can't take them in court. You can't do all this stuff. So, and they're not taught. I mean, they can be taught other places, but the Turks, Ataturk created, he's a great imagined community. There was no Turkey in. He just said, okay, we're all Turks. Anybody who isn't has to leave. And by the way, we all speak Turkish. And by the way, we all have a new written language. Our whole alphabet, and it's a better one, frankly. Actually, it is, because it's fine. So, but he did all this kind of cohesion. He's a very successful nation builder, using really exactly what Anderson talks about, taking this desperate group of people and creating a language, even an entire new alphabet, to express that language in which there's a nation. Imagine. So now I want to switch entirely. So some of you guys came for a technology talk, so I thought I'd give that. And some people are here for law, so I could do both. This is really about the three parts of the changes that are going on that drive the media gap. The first one is a fairly simple one. It's Moore's Law. You all know that. Chips get faster. Actually, he says, more because he was one of the transistor inventors, or not inventor, but one of the guys who actually invented integrated circuits, which followed up on the transistor invention. More transistors on the chip. That's really good, on an integrated circuit. That's the way he measures speed. And that's good. And you can see he just says it's going to keep cruising like this. And this should start to look familiar now. Bob Metcalfe, he invented Ethernet. So it follows that his law might have to do with connectivity. And sure enough, it does. He says the value of the telecommunications network is proportional to the square of the number of users. And this is to illustrate squares. It is not used to illustrate Led Zeppelin or Rush over here, or that were Wiccan. But you can see quickly that telecommunications really take off. But the law that I'm more interested in is David P. Reed's. David Reed is a really neat guy who said, all these networks are really good, but the intelligence at the nodes that can provide information into the network and to others is the most important part, by far. And he says it's exponential of the size of the network. And he actually cites social networks in there. And Reed's law is one of the best. And by the way, this bottom slide is Reed's, and this is how it relates to social networks as we know them on the web, are websites. One of the things that he noticed, and you probably heard this if you've been around watching the web at any time, and particularly media sites, all the media sites say, everybody will come to us because we have the best content. That's why we all go to YouTube, because they have the highest produced video. Well, maybe not. Okay, so, and he says, that will only get you so far. That's like Moore's. You have a fast standalone computer, but it doesn't really matter. And the next one is, we have the best website because we have more registered users than anybody else. And he goes, well, that's kind of missing the point. You have a lot of people registered, but if all they're doing is looking and it's all passive, it doesn't really matter. The real thing is the best facilitation, and that works like the social networks. In fact, if you have the best facilitation, you will have the most content, and you will have the most users. And we can see that with photo sharing. We can see that with map sharing. We can see that with video sharing. We can see that with sports bulletin boards. We can see that with all of these. The facilitation and how the community facilitates each other is what creates the value. Okay, so Clay Shirky has possibly the most subversively named book out there called Here Comes Everybody. How many recognize that as a character from literature? See, he does. And it's from?
Joyce.
And which book?
Ulysses.
I think it's from Finnegan's Wake.
I believe you're right, thank you.
And here comes, as you know, Joyce likes his characters to change names, and he has this character who is named HCE, and different permutations of HCE get called, and for a long time he gets called Here Comes Everybody. And what Shirky means is something slightly different. What Shirky does is say, remember that chart we just saw over there of Reed's? He says, Reed isn't really drawing it right. And now this may start to sound familiar. He's saying, if you have a small, like a pentagram conversation, a pentagram network, it's just conversation. It's just a few people talking to each other, 5 or 6 people. That's okay. And then he says, when you get in the middle here, it's loose conversation, which you have something tight, but a lot of loose connections going on. Then he says, when you have a lot more, it's broadcast. There's no way the hub can deal with all the other stuff that's going on. So, and this chart is number of members, by the way. So what we've done is we've gone all the way back to Newman. In the very beginning where Newman says, here's conversation, here's group participation, and here's broadcast. I've actually gone like right back. But what Shirky is thinking about here and how these kind of laws and these kind of construction of community works is he's saying, well, we understand broadcast, we understand this, but he's saying something else is going in this loose conversation. And the loose conversation is a lot like what Julia was talking about. How's the weather? But how's the weather is the most important conversation you can have. Why would that be?
Because everybody can relate to it in some way.
Pardon me? Go ahead. Because you don't want to get wet?
No, I said everybody talks about it, but nobody doesn't.
Ah, right. Who's that quote from? It's not Groucho Marx, right?
It's not WCPs.
And it's
Mark
not Groucho.
Twain.
Huh?
Mark Twain.
No, he didn't.
You don't think it's Marx?
I think it's Will Rogers.
Whoever it is. The important thing, and this is something Dunbar noticed, let's go back. Gossip is constructed by anthropologists. It's not just talking dirt on people, which with me is perfectly fine. But gossip is content-free communication, which you don't expect much back. Like, how's the weather? Oh, I like your earrings.
Isn't the term for that fag speech, or is that different?
Yeah, that would be the same. But Dunbar uses gossip in there. What he says is unritualized. Not unritualized, but content-free speech. You don't really expect an action out of it. You know, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Coffee here is really watery. Oh, yeah. I mean, you may find a little bit of value. Basically, Twitter. Most people's blogs, most of your teenage child or nephews, I am conversation. All that is the kind of grooming that goes on to keep these weak relationships, this loose conversation going so that you can actually make a point later. Because familiarity lets you have the authority and the trust to be able to tell it there. And it also gives you the position to tell it. You might not just walk up to somebody in the street. Suppose I don't know Don, and I might come here to Don and I might say, do you know about Robin Dunbar? I've really been thinking about this tough question about 8 brains. I would get smacked. But if we've met over coffee a few times, and I kind of have some idea about this guy, and some things have broken down, we will have that exchange, and he could actually receive it instead of thinking right away that I'm a nut. It might wait a few minutes. So the time delay of trust, if not full. So this period here of this loose conversation is actually the juice that lets us speak to each other and understand each other. Now, there are products that come out of this work because once you've kind of done this stuff, you can kind of raffle it up to other actions. So the first thing is if you just share stuff, oh, I can get pictures off of Flickr and other people can get pictures off of Flickr. It's a passive experience, really. I put stuff up, I choose to create a commons license. I don't really care. That's one way in which he calls publishing, but it really is a community activity in which you're starting to gain social capital by just letting people see your stuff, and you're starting to feel comfortable with it, and you have a certain thing in which you don't have to interact with these people, they can have your stuff. There's not really interaction involved, but sharing is happening. And that, you know, you feel kind of good, maybe I've shared it, but maybe you're not, nothing really happening. The next one is when you actually construct something, which is collaborative. I add a little bit to this. You can, you know, drop on a Google map where the cheapest gas price is that you've last seen, and somebody else can drop it, and somebody else can drop it, and somebody else can drop it, and pretty soon you have a valuable construct. It doesn't have to be as complex as Wikipedia. It could just be some other kind of collaborative information sharing in which your little bit helps everyone else be stronger. A little bit stronger tie, a little bit more interaction, and really very pervasive on the internet. The third one is he calls collective action internet groupings. Those are meetups, those are flash mobs. Those may not have a political end or a social end, but they could, and often do. People signing on to Change the World at changes.org. People that are carrying around the Obama app so that they can get the meetup alerts on their cell phone. This kind of collective thing that lets people who were very loosely connected suddenly come together in what Howard Rundle calls smart mobs and make some sort of change. The change may be a giant pillow fight or disco in our library, which happened at the last exam break. It could be collective letter writing campaigns. It's the kind of thing that mass media people say we make possible, but it turns out that we see collectively and ad hoc, very powerfully made possible within the internet. Then I'm going to take a break here and talk about this. These are people in the 1950s receiving word back from a time traveler who has traveled here to 2010. Here he is, and they say, you say people will tweet what they're eating for breakfast and upload pictures of their breakfasts to Facebook, and people will look at the breakfasts and make comments. And he says, no offense, future man, but everybody in your time must be retarded. And this guy says, sorry to bust your bubbles, dudes, but that's the way it is. And that's the future. And we're in that future in which, and now I'll talk about a couple of things quickly. I'm on till 3, right? We have 5 more minutes. Huh? I better have more slides. I do. Don't worry. Okay, so this gets to kind of my point. That all this weak stuff can be translated into action right up those 3 things. So, for example, my class was reading about the term folksonomy. It turns out one of the guys who I follow, who is frankly a boring Twitterer, who only Twitters about being a single father and stuff like this, is a guy named Thomas van der Waal. And Thomas van der Waal invented the word folksonomy. And Tom and I, we Twittered, and we have this nice loose relationship in which he sees what I'm doing, I see what he's doing, and frankly, we're banal. Where we are, when it comes to gossip, you know, we're not going to get the slicks, and we're definitely not good enough for a supermarket tabloid. But you know, we have this banal life, and I realized I've just read about Tom in this book, and I just say, oh Tom, could you come visit my class? And he went, oh yeah, but you know, I'm in DC and then I have to fly to Italy, but I could probably do it. And we just set up Skype, and Tom comes and visits my class. We have this rich relationship in my class, and then he kind of goes away. And we are back to our plain old loose connection, but all, right? So now there's a great study that was done out of this school that was in First Monday, and now it's just been collected in a couple of case books. It was a senior honors thesis by Brett Baumgartner. Does anybody know Brett's work? Called You've Been Poked. So I like it because I was on his committee, along with Jane Brown and Fred Stutzman, who were both more important than me. But Brett found several brilliant things out there, and things that like now they seem kind of like obvious, but not quite. What we knew from some work that Fred had done, we wondered, let me backtrack again. How many people here have Facebook pages? Okay. How many people had them 4 years ago? Okay. So this is why. Well, about 4 years ago, when Brett did this study, 98% of the undergraduates at UNC had Facebook pages. Less than 12% of the graduate students had Facebook pages. And Sarah Shields, me, Mr. T, Mr. Pibb, and Dr. Who, and somebody else who claimed they were professors at UNC. But Sarah and I were the only real people. Were on Facebook. At that time, you could only be in your own university's Facebook silo. Right, so it's a pretty good place to do an experiment, or at least to do a survey. So Brett's question was, why do people, the question was, there are 98% of the undergrads there. Why are undergrads loving and using Facebook to such a giant extent? And why do grad students not care? The question, so he did a snowball survey, and luckily he was connected. He had like 800 friends or something to start with, and the N back is greater than 1,000. Answers to a survey. It's pretty damn impressive. And the interesting thing, he asked, like, do you do it to hook up? Do you do it to find people that you have shared interest with? Do you do it, why? Why do you think people use Facebook?
Keep tabs on people.
Why would you keep tabs on them?
Because I want to know what people are up to without having to really make the effort.
I mean, it's an effort, you got to read it. You have an attention on it, right? Yeah, but you're right. The idea is to maintain weak ties in some ways by having a low-cost knowledge transaction about what they're doing and how they're doing, reminding each other on the birthday, poking, which was much more popular in that day because it's mostly undergrads, and why not? So, but if you think about it for a minute, undergrad social networks are disrupted at least twice a year, often 4 or 5 times, completely remade. When they first come to school, you come with your poor little pod from your hometown and a few other people you meet, and you all try to hang out, but then you meet a bunch of people in orientation, and you're all going to get together again because you had such a great orientation, and then you in different dorms and you never see them again. In our day. Then you go to class and you meet somebody and they're really kind of neat and you have like one interest that you'd really like to follow, but they live off campus. And it kind of falls away. So you have this tremendous, every semester in which you start shedding people and changing identity, frankly, because of your age. There's a great identity negotiation going on there. But what the need of the undergraduate or emerging adult, as Brett likes to call them, is to maintain these number of loose relationships in a world in which the transaction cost used to be very, very high. If you can push those transaction costs down, you can maintain 150 friends and no more. So that part I didn't study, frankly. But he did notice in here that this is largely what happened, that really maintaining relationships that were first initiated face-to-face was by far the strongest use. Not to create relationships which you had never met. Now there is that going on, but not to the same extent. And there's a follow-up study to that too that I reference in the notes if you'd like to see it. So this is where things get really pretty interesting. And in fact, one of the recent, the study that I couldn't find the numbers for, and that actually Fred referenced it, and he and I both swore that we saw this, and I did see it anecdotally. The fastest growing group on Facebook are women over 50 reconnecting with people they haven't seen in over 10 years and sharing the pictures of their grandchildren and children and remembering how their life used to be. These people are the same people who also used to be the majority population of genealogy groups.
Still are.
They still are, I think. Yeah. There's some like magic thing that happens. So, and all of this is this low transaction rate kind of gossipy thing in which you wish people happy birthday, you poke them, you send them a song you remember that they liked, you do all of this stuff to create a kind of community. Now, what did I do next? Oh, yeah, do y'all want to talk about that? Brain plasticity? You do? Okay, well, I started with evolutionary psychology, and part of evolutionary psychology says, you know, your brain is so big and it measures stuff in there and all. But what really changed evolutionary psychology in the last 7 or 8 years is functional MRI. Because you can see what's going on in the brain, as long as you don't mind that the brain is in this giant, clangy, electromagnetic nutcase, caramels. So after that, it's all cool. You can understand the brain pretty good. So one of the things that Gary Small, who really works mostly on aging issues, did in a Scientific American article in a 1/3 pretty good, 1/3 not so bad, and 1/3 completely sucks book called iBrain, is he looked at people who did not know the internet, who were over 50, who'd grown up reading or watching TV, or in these passive, less interactive environments, and what they did, and people who were younger and had used the internet since a very young age. And he had them do a number of activities, and this is Small's picture, so I really like that. And this is the internet naive reading text, and you can see how this person is processing text. And here's the internet savvy reading text, and it's a little more agitated. It's got a little more feels, there's a little more moved on. Where it really gets cool is, here's a web search. Somebody looking at the results of a web search, who's internet naive. And here's somebody looking at the results who's internet savvy. This brain here is thinking more like this brain, really more like this one. This brain is very, very active. It's processing all kinds of stuff that's going on that page in parallel. And it's lighting up other kinds of the brain. Now, the interesting thing, and this is why you will be me, if you aren't already, is brain plasticity says, and what he's done with his functional MRIs, is show that the internet naive does not stay this way. In a number of weeks, they start behaving like this. That even though like we talk about the aging brain and how can't get a clue and how dumb we are and we just lose stuff, actually we are trainable. That over 50s can't get a clue, and our brains too can go red. So in the same way. And so small stuff is interesting in that way, but it also means that the way that we're receiving and parsing and interacting with communication is now having a different way. You know, in a way that when we talked about before, I was talking about conceptualizing law and conceptualizing social and conceptualizing community, but it's not limited to that. That something else is also changing in that way. If we believe these MRIs and we read right in various evolutionary doctrine. Okay, now what do I do next? Okay, I want to skip this so we can do questions. This is another thing that I do. I recommend this. Things that make me weak and strange get engineered away. It's really about things that we claim are nerds and make us social outcasts. That is, I'll do it quick. Attention deficit disorder, inability to get visual or emotional cues, strange jargon of tasks and games, social isolation or friendlessness, and idiosyncratic humor. I've been perfectly described. How in the world of internet engineering and our new society, our new community, these actually become strengths and superpowers. So no longer is it attention deficit disorder, it's really multitasking. And that's better. It's better than normal. Normal people, they thought it was attention deficit disorder because they were normal, but really they weren't. Text-based and icons, replacing human face-to-face. we all know when somebody makes a joke and you don't get it, how bad that feels. But we know if you put a smiley face beside it, at least you have a prayer that's a joke. So geeks who could never read faces, who could never figure out, who spent like a long time talking face to face to somebody they really liked while that person kept saying, I have to wash my hair, I wonder what about my fingernails? Like, and we just keep talking because we think that must mean that they're interested. We don't get it. But, you know, visual cues are replaced, or facial tics and stuff, they're replaced by emoticons, which are perfectly understood. You can't get them wrong, they're binary. Mainstream of our language is that, you've probably heard it, OMG and stuff like that. We redefine friendship the way Tom talked about it. You know, Tom wants to know, how about your friends on Facebook? Tom, I don't want to break this to you, they're not your friends.
I guess we're not.
Actually, they are in a geeky kind of sense, because our circle of intimacy is further out, either because there's a prostheses effect, or which there's some studies just out from Facebook that say that's probably not true, that your actual maintenance, what they measure, maintenance of friends, which means that you interact with people in your friend group, averages just below 150. That most people's individual interactions with other people on Facebook, that those exchanges are the number.
Can you back up to the slide where you had the media at the top and the telephone at the bottom?
Yeah, very first one.
Yeah.
I can. There's probably a better way to do this, but I always wanted to be a slideshow person.
So, in a way, in every period of history, metaphorically speaking,
Right. Okay. I don't know every period.
In
That's
every
a
period of history, you always have a kind of a more formal upper strata and a more informal bottom strata.
Right.
Even before media.
Right. Right.
So, the media
Church
gap,
Latin and vernacular Latin, for example.
the media gap could be construed as like some kind of interactions going on all the time, couldn't it?
Well, interaction as long as the members decide to be interactive. So there's an ability study of like use of phones and stuff like that, that if you have a wireless telephone or you use a wireless computer or whatever, the probability of you interacting with more people digitally is higher than if you have to walk somewhere and sit down and plug it in. So connectivity, if you lower the cost of it talks to make a communication, then there'll be more communication. I mean,
Would you argue
it's pretty basic economics, really.
it's kind of a kind of unseen but present competition of communities here?
Oh yeah.
And the more formal ones competing against the more.
Oh yeah, and our understanding is from a regulatory standpoint, like when I talk to these lawyers, the guys who really wanted to restrict behaviors on internet forums, they were, as I told them, I think that's a hegemonic move in which you're trying to keep highly articulate, complex verbal thinkers such as yourself on top of a bunch of people that just want to talk about their cats. You know? And I think the cats people are possibly more important because they're massaging, they're doing this interaction that leads to later transference.
They possibly could argue that since Gutenberg, that there's the kind of democratization of information, but that didn't occur for a long time.
Oh no!
Now we're beginning.
Exactly. The book I was looking for, the printing, on the faculty list, I was asking for a book called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, which documents like the several hundred years of social change punctuated by changes in printing and how printing was accepted and how it was constructed or resisted. That's a great one. I think this is just like faster, and the moral panic is still there. We've got to stop things from happening, and often, like these lawyers saying, people are chatting are snarky. How dare they be snarky? A whole book by an idiot at the New Yorker. And I don't want to get snarky about it, but really, what a dumb thing. Okay, sorry, I was getting meta and nobody got it. So, let me see if I can get us. I think I got us forward here a little bit. The last part is kind of a joke, but kind of not a joke, by the way, because the social construction of what we understand how normalized or the mores of our internet villages are really kind of established by really Stuart Brand and the Well and the whole catalog, as Fred Turner talks about in Counterculture, Cyberculture, and also What the Dormouse Said by John Markoff, in which they really try to trace what we expect, that there should be a culture of sharing, that you shouldn't have to pay for it, that speakers should own their own words. All those really come out of the Well, and all these propositions. Bands should interact with their audience, because the most active forum other than parenting on the Well was the Grateful Dead fans. And the band participated. And the band invited people to come. And the band, one of their songwriters wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, so that everything could be like a Grateful Dead concert, which is scary in terms of hygiene. So, but I mean, pretty good. And what this is everything that's Web 2.0. And some of these companies are already out of business. Huh?
There were 2 pages.
Oh, that's right. There are 2 pages. This is the 1 page. But many of you guys recognize these. These are all ones in which people contribute and get stuff back and understand. And a lot of them are just about facilitation. And within that facilitation, they create a sort of little group of morers and understanding, some expressed and some not expressed, that are very, very strong, that let large groups happen. And there's a story about Craigslist, why Craigslist works, that we can do in a second. And there we are. You will be Cybermen, you will be upgraded. And somebody asked me, I did a whole thing about 3, so it was a different talk. And these are references that you can look at later. And here's really what I'm worried about, so you can see from the beginning. I have 4 different groups of questions that I think need to be paid attention to, and I actually wonder how you can get the research tools to answer these questions. Some of them people have, but I'm not sure they are. So one of them is, if there are 3 legal conceptions about how this kind of interchange happens, which one of those really apply? Because we have one group trying to think of it as press, and we have another group trying to think of it as speech, and a whole other group trying to think of it, we'll make the ISPs responsible. You can use what you want, but we'll just tax the ISP. You can look at what you want, but we'll make the ISP control it. You know, it's really a broadcast model. You know, it's not a scarcity, there's a created scarcity because there are only a couple of providers. But the scarcity argument isn't really used, it's an argument of management because of panic. And then what sections of the First Amendment really apply? When I was talking to Bill Marshall, and he said, well, if you don't think it's really speech and you don't think it's really press, what the hell do you think it is anyway, and why does it have anything to do with the First Amendment? And I said, well, possibly it's about assembly. There's not a whole lot of history, by the way, about assembly. And so people who are doing legal work, it's actually a very rich place to be, because if you could theorize and help form the way the next case law will be taken, how it will be interpreted, with thinking about assembly and association, and possibly redress, although Obama just took care of that today. At 11:30, right? How many watched Obama's press conference? Yeah, I think he did this one. And he just was there interacting with internet questions. So you already have redress, the reader's part. Then the next question, and people are starting to do this, and there's already a little debate in which the Facebook people said, well, you're really only maintaining 50 because those are only individuals that 150 because that's who you interact with, and immediately Dana Boyd and Fred and other people who are smarter went, no, that's not right. You don't know monkeys from monkeys. You know, that's not it at all. But it's still this question out there is, can you make that bigger? And, you know, just because we call them friends, because it makes friendless geeks feel better, you know, to have lots of friends. Me and Tom, we think we have hundreds of friends, and it turns out we actually have no more than 150. But we thought we had 675, but we don't. But this where things fit in this sort of Dunbar spheres of intimacy, really is a good question to ask. And then the other one is, and this bothered me like the more I'm reading about, is brain information is being revealed through functional MRI and other means. And we're able to actually image what's going on and what's firing. And we're able to have some idea of what's going on. What does that change of brain activity mean when we're talking about communications and how we perceive each other and how we interact? And if the brain is plastic, don't forget brain plasticity is not a very old concept, really, as far as physiology goes. You know, we sort of thought, well, it's plastic when you're a kid, and then in your 20s, that's all you get. After that, you just start losing until you end up like battling like this. So that seems like a good one. And the other one is a social capital question, which is, we know how social capital works in meat space and stuff, and people are trying to do all kinds of measures of social capital within social networking because actually you can. And it's a whole lot easier than going and surveying or observing people in their homes or trying to get them to keep a telephone log or that kind of stuff. So it's a rich place to look at that and to even reconceptualize social capital exchanges.
Would you argue on your number 2 that it's possible that if you imagine a scale, if you're going from 0 down to 150 theoretically, whether or not
or bigger,
loosely,
yeah,
that there's a parallel scale that has something to do with personal happiness or?
Okay, so happiness studies are a different one that I'm kind of interested in, but I don't know that much about. And we have somebody who just did, what is her book called? It's not called Positivity. It is called Positivity in our psychology department, who's a big okay, so studying, psychology used to be like studying why people are screwed up. And somebody said, you know, I hate being in a field in which you only study like why people are broken. It would be really nice to figure out why people might not be broken, like why they might be happy, like why people want to have an aesthetic state and could you have it for a long time, and why you want to be pleased and how your brain allows you or keeps you from being happy. And Gilbert has something called Stumbling on Happiness as a sort of popularization of this study group. And then there are a couple of people in Europe that are trying to measure the happiness of nations. You know, like whether you're happy or if you're a Dutch person or a Spanish person or something. And then, God, I can't remember her name. The Positivity book is just out, and it's also
Fredrickson.
Barbara Fredrickson, right? Barbara Fredrickson's book, and it's called Positivity, right? Yeah, and I haven't read that book. I have read Gilbert, and I will say that it reads like Gilbert's giving a lecture. So if you like that and you like that he thinks he's cracking jokes and stuff, which I liked, but I gave it to a bunch of lawyers to read, and they were going, oh, "We don't even think he's funny." And I'm like, well, it's possibly because you're lawyers. Not famous for their humor. But I thought it was funny, but my bar is fairly low, as you may have noticed during this talk. So, but that's a great question, is what component of social capital, and social capital has different components, you know, knowledge capital, you know, in which you just give information to each other and you get it back. There is some sort of support function, this sort of mutuality thing, but there aren't people that just like make you happy, you know, to be around them. You know, they just sort of have some sort of upbeat thing and you want to be around them and stuff, and that happiness, I mean, and there is some like number maybe that you're happy to be around, and like after that you feel kind of funky or kind of overwhelmed. You know, it's sort of like the kids are all right. You know, sometimes I must have to get out of the light and leave her behind where the kids are all right. They're all right, and so the essence of the speech is the kids gossiping on IM and posting on Facebook and stuff, they're all right. And So thanks, I think, unless there's more questions I can answer.